everybody for joining us today. My name is Adrienne Wilson, and I am one of a team of wellness coordinators here supporting work for promoting wellness with the Student Wellness Center. And today we're going to be looking at ways that you can find balance, particularly when life is imbalanced. I'm going to be talking more or less about stress management strategies and tips for graduate as well as professional students. So, by the end of today's presentation, you should be able to walk away and be able to maybe recognize ways that stress can show up in your particular life and the way it impacts your health and well being. You should also be able to, maybe distinguish between some examples of adaptive as well as maladaptive coping strategies when it comes to stress management, as well as apply practical time management and boundary setting techniques that will fit in and help you, be more at ease and well when it comes to managing the various responsibilities that you have as graduate students, as well as identify ways to integrate self care practical strategies into your daily lives. And we'll close off with discussing a bit more about some of the campus health and wellness resources. And ideally, after that, you should be able to identify as well as locate resources that really support your health and well being. And so, as you see here on the screen, I just want to start off with a statistic that we have here. We see, and this was a study that was conducted and reported out in 2023, where they found that based off of a national study of graduate students, that basically 3 in 4 students in the US here report feeling stressed, with nearly half reporting feeling not only stressed, but also overwhelmed. And nearly 4 out of 10 students report feeling exhausted frequently or all the time. Now, when I share this oftentimes with other graduate students, they're like, yeah, that pretty much tracks with the experience that I've, had in my time as a graduate student. And so it's nothing more or less to, highlight something as a deficit or a problem or to scare people away from graduate school, but really to highlight a reality that many of us experience. And also to show that, if you feel these ways, you're not alone. Many graduate as well as professional students also experience feeling oftentimes overwhelmed and stressed out, and oftentimes feel very much tired or exhausted. All right. So, with that being said, I want to just take a moment really to even just start to make sure that we are working with similar language when it comes to this idea of stress. And so, the definition that I have here in our presentation comes from the American Psychological Association, and they define stress as both either, I should say, a physiological or even a psychological response to either an internal or external stressors. So again, this can be something you feel on like a physical level or even just psychologically. The stressors can be coming from our thoughts or even things that we're maybe processing or observing outside of us, maybe through media or news that we encounter. And so, with that being said, I like to also describe stress within kind of two larger categories. The first is eustress. Now, eustress is categorically more of something you can say is more of a motivating or a positive stress response. Oftentimes, I think about eustress within maybe the perspective, let's say a person has a presentation. And so there might be some little bit of anxiousness or nervousness in advance of presenting in front of colleagues or even in front of an audience where you have some level of stake and it gives you a little bit of the butterflies. Great thing is, after you do the presentation performance or whatnot, typically those levels of the butterflies in the stomach and that stress begin to dissipate and they go away. Whereas in situations where we would categorize it more as distress, this is more of that negative response to stressors. And some other features related to distress, oftentimes when we experience this, it's not like an acute, maybe one here, maybe once there, but it sometimes can be chronic. It's that distressing feeling, either again, the stimuli being internal, external, that really doesn't turn off. You constantly are feeling it. Maybe, as you see here, we have a person here looks like maybe like they're an intern in a medical program. But again, it's something that's negative. It doesn't motivate. It's not going to, get you that extra push to get something accomplished or finished. But it's really that negative stressor, again, maybe internally or externally, where it might be more chronic and harder to kind of turn off. And so here on this next slide, I have something which is called the performance anxiety curve, which was adapted by the Yerkes-Dodson law, which shows the association between student performance as well as their student activity, or student anxiety or even stress levels. And so as you see with the bell curve, more so on at least my left in the green, we see that in and of itself, having too little stress, it's not necessarily something that's good. I mean, sometimes we think, oh, if we have no stress, maybe my life will be easier. Actually, that's not what this law finds. We still need some level of stress to really help us engage from being inactive to get us activated towards a particular behavior or performance or something that needs to be done. Now, there actually is this place where, in terms of, that stressor and its relationship to our performance, where there's more of an optimal sweet spot. We have something, at least maybe we're motivated by maybe a particular deadline or maybe because of a grade, but there's some level of stress or there's some motivation that actually gets us to that place where we're not only activated, but we're also able to perform a bit better. And as you see, as we get to that tipping point, there is a point where, that stress, those anxiousness that we feel actually starts to have a negative impact on our performance as students. When we get to that place where maybe instead of feeling like, I have that motivation, I'm able to get the work done, but if it feels like, oh my gosh, I feel overwhelmed or overloaded, and we're starting to notice how this is somaticizing, for example, feeling very tired or it's hard to focus or you feel exhausted, that might actually indicate that you've gone over that tipping point. And potentially, if it's not necessarily like mitigated or addressed, you could be more at higher risk of burnout. And again, your performance will definitely take a negative, a negative impact, or will take a toll on your performance as a student. So, that being said, a major takeaway from this slide is to show that stress inherently in and of itself isn't something that's negative or has a negative impact on our performance as students, but it's really about trying to find that sweet spot, being able to, use it as something to help activate and going from a place of stasis and not doing much to get you activated and motivated towards a particular behavior or to reach a particular end. But at the same time, once that it's done, hopefully getting to a place where it doesn't continue on and where you're kind of more at this chronic level of feeling, stressed. And again, that having negative implications on performance. So, with that being said, now I'd like to transition over and kind of looking at some of these intersections of stress, particularly with regards to our health, how we learn, and our ability to connect. All right, so starting with some of those intersections of stress and health, we know that with long term stress exposure, there are many negative health implications that are associated with that. This slide is not an all inclusive listing, but there is definitely research to show that association. When we are exposed to long term or those chronic stressors, it adds to an increased risk of anxiety and depression. Some folks might relate to having, experiencing digestive program problems where it's like difficult maybe to eat, or maybe they're having issues with IBS that might be associated with more of that long-term chronic stress. It can also put someone maybe at higher risk of heart disease. It can complicate or make it really tough to have like quality sleep when we're constantly stressed. It might be also associated for some with weight gain or potentially even weight loss. We also know that there's plenty of research that backs up that immune functioning can be compromised when exposed to chronic long term stressors. And in addition to that, it can also impact our memories, our working memory over time. And when it comes to like cognition and learning, we also know that high levels of stress can, again, this is not finding that sweet spot going back to that bell curve. But again, this is more that long term chronic stressors. We know that it can hinder one's academic performance by impairing focus, our ability to actually not only recall, but just our memory and even our problem solving abilities. If you want to look into that, there's plenty of research, but if anything, high level, we know that chronic stress definitely has a negative implication on how we're able to learn. And now switching over to some of those intersections of stress when it comes to our ability to connect and even the quality of relationships that we have are able to maintain. We know again, when we are experiencing higher levels of stress, it can really make it harder for us to show up in ways that may really reflect, how we would like to show up. It may make it difficult for us, for example, to listen. Now, I don't know about you all, but I'm a parent. And now when I'm stressed, it's really hard to stay focused and to empathize maybe with the need of my child, which in my mind, I might have things that feel like are more immediate stressors, and I can't help you find your doll shoe at that moment. That's one example. But again, I want to show up as a parent as my best and highest self and to really empathize and show that this is a concern and I'm here to support. But when I'm stressed, I'm almost a little bit laser focused on that stressor and trying to mitigate it. But all that to say, it can also impact, for example, how I communicate. I might be more short and direct with others. And that may not be my intention, but it can compromise over time, especially if this starts becoming a regular way of how I communicate and show up with people I care about, maybe on a family level or my colleagues. It can really have a negative impact on just the quality of the relationships and can potentially contribute to tension with either friends, our intimate partners, their family members, maybe even our mentors and others that we engage with, our colleagues. As I mentioned kind of on the previous slide, we also know that, higher levels of the stress, again, can have impacts on our motivation and how we engage. And, are we taking up time to really engage in opportunities maybe that can help us professionally? Oftentimes, if we're stressed, we may or may not have that energy or that extra drive to do things beyond the bare minimums. I need to get this class. I have to make sure I'm showing up for this particular project, but I may not feel motivated to take those extra steps, maybe for leadership opportunities or taking on extra things that really could help me out in my portfolio as a student and potentially with my career. But again, because I might be under high levels of stress, I just may not have the bandwidth to do that. Which again, not in all cases, but potentially can impact, prospects when it comes to like our academic experience as well as professional growth. And so, one thing I want to be very explicit about and share as a kind reminder, we don't always have the ability to control if and when stressful events happen. I'm preaching to the choir. You all probably know this. But one thing I do want to out is we can control how we respond to the stressors. It may not feel like it at the moment. And it might be something we have to really kind of like exercise that muscle. We do have the agency, if anything, and maybe with more intentionality, we can actually control how we respond to those stressors. So I'm going to spend some time kind of talking about that a bit more, particularly with respect to maybe just some coping strategies that you can employ or maybe you're currently using to manage your stress. And so when it comes to coping strategies, oftentimes and it can be a variety of different ones, we tap into these strategies really to help us cope with those negative emotions or experiences that are kind of like caused by different stressors. Okay. Higher level speaking, coping strategies can be considered adaptive, just generally speaking, more beneficial or positive. Or, we might have some of those maladaptive coping strategies. Again, they're helping us deal with the stressors, but again, they can fall within kind of like two buckets, either adaptive or maladaptive. Okay. And so I'm going to spend some time kind of like looking in a little bit closer at both the maladaptive and adaptive, and more specifically looking at coping strategies that can be categorized as more task oriented, emotion oriented, and avoidance oriented. So we'll start off with task-oriented coping strategies. Now, generally speaking, we would think these task-oriented coping strategies would be considered adaptive or beneficial. Okay. Oftentimes, when we tap into these task-oriented coping strategies, they help us really address the root of a problem. Let's say you have to get something accomplished. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, so I'm able to get to accomplishing what it is that I need to set out to accomplish. And oftentimes, they help by helping us focus on addressing things that we can control during those stressful times. Maybe I need to be able to control, let's say, time blocking, or I need to have certain materials to accomplish a particular um, feat, or I have to complete a particular, task. And so here I just have a couple of examples to kind of illustrate what these are when it comes to task-oriented strategies. These are things that we can do again to help mitigate those feelings of stress. Some folks like really, depending on or using to-do list. Sometimes when we feel so overwhelmed and we don't know where to start, maybe starting with actually just kind of dumping them down on paper or, using your devices and just writing out what is it I need to do. From there, I have it all in one place, and maybe I can start working backwards to make sure I know the steps to achieve what it is that I'm aiming to achieve. And again, also when we can prioritize various tasks. So let's say continuing on with the to-do list. Once you have your to-do list, maybe prioritizing, okay, is this something I need to do more immediately, or is this something maybe I can do later? In terms, again, that goes with urgency or non-urgency. Or is this something, that really calls my attention I need to do now because there's some significance beyond like timeline, but I need to prioritize accordingly. Some folks also find it really helpful to have or to develop their own action plans. Once they've identified goals, like what are the steps I'm going to take? What are some milestones I can identify to know that I've achieved my goals? Other task-oriented strategies include using time blocking, which I kind of referred to maybe about a minute or so ago, or even taking, larger projects or things that just feel like it's almost like this constellation and just I'm overwhelmed with all the things that need to be done, but maybe breaking those down into smaller, more manageable steps. Okay. And then again, another thing that can be considered task oriented in terms of strategies is even seeking out information or utilizing resources, maybe in your department, or even let's say with the Dentist Learning Center, but getting some supports to help you get yourself oriented so that you can achieve whatever tasks that you have more in the immediate or maybe later on. So moving on from the task-oriented coping approach to dealing with our stressors, there's the emotion-oriented coping strategies. Now, these more generally would be considered adaptive, and they're aimed at helping one aid in becoming less emotionally reactive in stressful situations. So it's not like here are these particular tasks, but what can I do, especially when I feel like the stressor, whether it's a looming deadline or just the stresses of just being a person alive at this time and day and space that we're in, when these things are beyond our control. What are some emotional oriented strategies that I can apply in my life to help me be less emotionally reactive? A couple of examples I have listed here on the slide. Tapping into our ability to reframe or shift perspective. Again, it's not getting into a place where I'm being delusional, but it's like, hey, okay, so let's say, for example, I get uh I get a paper back or I worked on a project and let's say, for example, I didn't get the grade or I wasn't evaluated in a way that I feel was, really reflected my hard work. And let's say basically I just didn't get the score or the grade I wanted. You can do many things with that. But also, I think even just giving yourself the opportunity to reframe and what are the learning opportunities? What are some things I can reflect moving forward and say, hey, well, did I give myself enough time? Is there anything, to go with this feedback? Is there anything I can learn and apply? Again, I'm a student. I'm being trained to be an expert, remembering that. I don't have to be the expert, but what can I glean from a particular situation or opportunity that has came? Opportunity may not look like it, but is there an opportunity or anything I can gain from this that will help equip me for future situations? Is really what I'm getting at. Also, tapping into some of our emotional supports. This could be maybe, close friends or folks that maybe a mentor, other people in your lives to also kind of like help lift you up at those times you might feel more emotionally down. Maybe it also looks like tapping into some of the services we have here on campus, whether it's wellness coaching or connecting with maybe one of the counseling and consultation counselors that are available for students. Another thing that many people find very value add, and also there's plenty of research to back it up, is utilizing, meditation strategies, which I'll talk a little bit more in the future slides. Maybe journaling and taking our thoughts and our emotions and taking it from here in our heads and writing it down. That can be very helpful for people, especially when they're, maybe feeling overwhelmed or they're having blockage. Just starting to doodle or even journal, right, can be very cathartic and help us kind of like mitigate those stressors and feeling like overwhelmed. For others, maybe playing with pets or being engaged in activities that take us away from that feeling of stress, even if it's for a short amount of time, can really help us as well. And another area, of course, is exercising. It's really hard to stay in a place where we're like anxious or really sad. If our body is producing, certain chemicals, that serotonin, we're exercising, and it can really help us, especially with our emotions and our feelings, to kind of recalibrate and feel a bit more balanced. All right, so far I've talked about task oriented and emotion oriented coping strategies that are pretty much adaptive and beneficial. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those potentially maladaptive coping strategies. Okay. And so when I'm talking about this, there's plenty of examples of what this can look like. But oftentimes, some of the strategies, a couple examples here on the slide, can really kind of feel good in the moment. They may lower our stress levels because oftentimes we can avoid the stressor, right? Or the feelings that come with being stressed. But ultimately, it's not really kind of helping out in the long run, right? Oftentimes when we're doing things that are kind of avoidant oriented, again, it doesn't solve the issue and it doesn't mean that the stressors won't return. It helps in the moment. And that could be, for example, like tuning out and just, watching Bingo, Netflix, kind of Hulu for several hours. Again, that might feel good. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing necessarily. It might be good sometimes to take a break. But if this is our natural go-to and it starts having negative implications on like, am I getting my work done? Am I avoiding other people? Am I not, achieving what it is I want to achieve because I'm spending too much time watching TV, on social media, texting or calling, whatever that is? That's something to kind of rethink. I don't know about you, but I know for myself, um, I like having actual tangible results in place that really show me that, I'm still being productive. And that goes through cleaning. I'm telling you, I might have a deadline or I might have something I need to attend to, but I know that hot soapy dishwater or like my clean living room, it eases me in the moment. I feel good. But afterwards, I'm like, oh, snap, I still have to attend to X, Y, or Z responsibility or task. So, I mean, I got some good tangible results, clean place, but nonetheless, that deadline is still there and I still need to, produce what it is that, I'm being held responsible for. Other folks, it might look like maybe overeating or consuming other substances such as alcohol or other things. Or for some folks, they avoid things by spending. Again, it's that adrenaline punch or that good feeling, that oxytocin, we're actually, getting something in the moment. It feels great. Maybe I made those purchases, some kind of like spending, they say retail therapy feels good in the moment. But all in all, usually we can consider it as maladaptive and doesn't really help kind of in the long term in terms of like helping us manage our stress. All right. And so I'm going to offer you an opportunity in your free time to really kind of like consider a couple of the questions that we have here on the screen. So even just, in your own time, just reflecting on, hey, what are my go-to coping strategies when I feel overwhelmed and stressed? Some of us may or not even be conscious of that. And are, those strategies adaptive or maladaptive? Again, we might just think they're strategies and I do this when I'm under stress, but really taking a moment to consider, is this really something that's beneficial? Or in the long term, maybe more maladaptive? And then also invite you to think about maybe what are some additional strategies that you can look into or be willing to try out to help really kind of like build that coping strategy toolkit, for lack of better words, for yourself. So, with that, now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit more about ways that we can utilize time management strategies to help us find more balance in our lives as graduate students. And so, one of the first strategies I'm going to talk about is something that you may or you may not do, but it's time blocking. And this could look like, for example, looking at your calendar. Let's say you use Outlook calendar, or if you have maybe like I still use this. I'm a very much an analog girl in the digital world in many respects. I still have my calendar and I still write things down, but I use it and I know, for example, let's say in the morning when I'm more attentive and I have less distractions, I might just block out maybe an hour for administrative tasks or answering emails. The whole idea is being very conscious of how you use your time and maybe making sure that not only are you blocking it out for particular activities, doing your best to commit to actually using that time to do those activities. Okay. And again, those activities can be time for studying, maybe getting some, exercise in or having times to connect with others, whether it's a telephone call or going out to have coffee or meeting up with friends. Okay. And again, using this strategy can be very beneficial in helping to establish more of a structure to your day. And potentially, again, if you're actually kind of like doing your best to use this strategy, it can help with reducing distractions from maybe other tasks that come in hand if you commit to those times. And again, it's an iterative process. You might have to adjust, things can come up, but the whole idea is just being intentional about how you are using your time. Okay. It might take some practice. You might find something, works these days and different times, but I invite you to really kind of like try this out and it might be really a helpful strategy for you. The next thing I have here is an image of something called the Eisenhower matrix. And so this is a really helpful tool, especially like for folks, and I find myself in this situation sometime when it comes to like, I have, again, it feels like a constellation of things that I need to attend to, but I don't know where to start. The cool thing about this Eisenhower matrix is that it helps you to categorize or at least put these things in buckets based off of urgency or non-urgency. Like, do I need to get to this like this week? Or is this something by the end of 2026 or whatever it is, whatever time period? Is it urgent or non-urgent? And then also, as you see on the y-axis, you have that importance or significance. Is this something important or non-important? And so, for example, when it comes to you have your task, you identify what needs to be done. When it comes to where I need to prioritize and start putting some, action to it, it might be more so once you identified what is important and urgent. These are tasks that have most likely explicit deadlines and need to be attended to that are important at a particular point of time, kind of more proximally to a particular like in time versus things that you can put off for a little bit later. Now, again, as you're looking through your list, you might have some things that are still important, but maybe you don't need to attend to them at this very moment. Okay. These oftentimes are tasks with unspecified deadlines, but ultimately lead to long term success or your goals. Again, you got to clean your place, I think, but I don't necessarily need to, you know, like completely clean out my basement, today, it feels good, but I can get to it eventually. It's important. It'll help me with my long term, goals and my environmental well being and my mental health, but nonetheless, that might be important but non-urgent, as an example. Now, when it comes to urgency, okay, so let's say, for example, you have something that it needs to be attended to more urgently, but in the grander scale of things, is it really important or not? When it's not so important but needs to be urgent, this might be an opportunity for you to delegate a particular task to someone else who can get it done. And it doesn't necessarily have to be you, and it doesn't have to be something, that you have to stop what you're doing. But again, point is, maybe let's say there are certain tasks, and maybe amongst your family members, or if you have, roommates, maybe somebody else can attend to it because you have something that's more important and urgent, and maybe somebody else, or even like using AI to help. Whatever that looks like, I'm not encouraging in either way, but these are the tasks that you potentially could delegate to somebody else. And then lastly, there are those things that we may have on our list that are not like super urgent and they're not like very important. And these are things that I invite you to kind of reconsider and be like, yo, can I actually like nix this off of my list? And again, these might be the unnecessary tasks or just distractions. And, oh, maybe I need to go, do X, Y, or Z. Again, if you have, of course, we all have limited time, space, and energy on certain things. If you're kind of like prioritizing things, there might be some things that you can delete that make things feel a lot more manageable. By again, looking at this, creating a matrix, this could be a helpful tool. Things that you can do, things you can schedule for later, potentially delegate to others, or even delete are some considerations that we invite you to think about. Another technique is something called the Pomodoro technique. A lot of students that find this very helpful. I find it helpful. And this is an opportunity where basically you break down tasks into focus intervals, all right? And you take short breaks. Now, for example, let's say I know that I have a certain amount of time and I might find it challenging to sit for maybe a couple hours and read or work on a particular, assignment. Well, for some folks, it might be helpful to set yourself a timer and maybe just work on it for 25 minutes straight. You're not trying to complete everything in 25 minutes, but you're giving yourself 25 minutes and then you take a short 5 minute break. Maybe you go put some clothes in the laundry, or maybe you go, get a sip of water, you do a quick walk. You come back and then you work on another interval of 25 minutes. You do the work section and you take a 5 minute break. And you do another 25 minutes and then you take another break. And then after you've gone through that cycle like 4 times, that's when you take a more like a 15 or a 30-minute break. Again, some people find this a really helpful technique because it can help some folks really stay more focused. Again, working in shorter spurts of time, but they're able to get more done versus like, oh my God, I don't have it. There's just so much needs to be done and I don't have any kind of like brackets around how I use my time. So again, a strategy may be helpful for some. Some people, for example, might find like, hey, well, actually, I work better when I have longer periods of time. Again, just something to think about, and it may be in a tool that you might be interested in applying. An additional approach is something from a book I actually came across when I was a graduate student called Eat That Frog. And so this method more or less encourages folks to really tackle that more challenging or the thing you want to avoid most or that dreaded task, doing that first or at the start of your day so that the rest of the day can flow with more ease. Now, follow me for a moment. So it's like identifying what is that frog, all right, or that proverbial frog, or what is that thing that you're like most avoidant of or you really don't want to get to? This approach is really encouraging you to do that first because after attending to that, you feel oftentimes more relief. It's been done. It can help avoid procrastinating any like further on that particular task. And for some people, once they get that big kind of like time blocker or that thing that they've been trying to avoid, once they get that done, it almost feels like this level of like refreshment that they're feel more productive because they're like, I was able to get this thing done. These other things that are not as kind of scary or things I'm avoidant, it's going to come with probably a bit more ease. So again, it's helping you with making real progress towards accomplishing your goals, or at least getting a few of these things off of your to-do list. Of course, I also would like to encourage folks again, let's make the most of the technology that we have access to. If, for example, there are any applications that you've come across, and you can easily do a search, but finding applications that maybe can help you in managing your tasks or with time management, right? Maybe using Google Calendar or, Microsoft To Do is an example of something where you have one platform, you can enter information, you don't have to have like 30 or 40 notebooks around, and maybe you still do. I have both. I use both of these, but it can really help you kind of streamline your process and help you with potentially managing your time. Okay. And so, with that being said, um, giving you a couple of ideas. Again, it's not a fully inclusive list of all time management strategies, but hopefully you can maybe identify one or two ways, or maybe a couple of strategies that can help you in your process, especially if you're still trying to figure out what's the best way to manage various tasks or responsibilities I have in my life. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about boundary setting. And so again, I want to invite you to kind of think a little bit more, especially intentionally around this concept of boundary setting and how we think maybe boundary setting can really help us with stress management and helping to create more of a balanced life during your experience as a graduate student. So, that being said, I have a few signs or just some things maybe you want to recognize that can be kind of a telltale sign that maybe we need to work on kind of like strengthening that muscle when it comes to boundary setting. For example, if you happen to notice that you're feeling a little bit more resentment towards others. Again, not to say in the event that, people have done something and you have resentment in response to maybe an injustice or being treated wrong. But maybe it's like, oh gosh, this person in my life, they're always asking of me. And it's just like I say yes, but I mean, I just start feeling resentful. I feel like I keep pouring into the other people's proverbial cups, but I just feel like I'm left feeling drained. That might be a sign that, hey, maybe I need to revisit or really consider how I am implementing boundaries. If you're oftentimes feeling drained or anxious or just guilty or burned out, that also can be flag that maybe, we need to work on boundary setting. Again, if we're always saying yes to things that we don't necessarily want to do, but almost feel out of like obligation, that is also another opportunity to work on boundary setting. We find it hard to relax. We're always kind of like anxious or thinking, oh, I need to attend to or support someone else, or you just can't relax. That again could be something around boundary setting and not necessarily with another individual, but even boundaries around like how I'm using my time and my resources, right? If you happen to feel like you're losing a part of yourself because you're constantly agreeing, right, to commitments that may or may not be important to you, or may or may not be important at this particular space and place and time in your life, it might be a great opportunity to really revisit and even just consider like, what are my boundaries around said event, said obligation, said responsibility, or said request. Oops. And so, with that being said, again, we're considering ways that boundary setting might be associated with our stress management, and here are some signs. Well, Adrian, what are some tips and strategies to really help me in that area? Again, I think it's important, if anything, being able to identify what are our priorities and our non-negotiables. Not all of us have taken out time or can on the spot, if I had a microphone and I was interviewing you, like, can I and then say, hey, what are your priorities and non-negotiables? Not everybody has an automatic response. And that's okay. I'm not saying you need to, but it might be something to really take some time and again, intentionality on being able to identify these things. So that again, once we know what our priorities and non-negotiables are, we're able to really help support and develop boundaries so that these are not being violated or undermined. And again, once we know what our boundaries are, it's going to be a lot easy for us to communicate and demonstrate them more clearly and assertively. Again, I use the word assertively here, in a way to kind of like teach folks and let people know this is the boundary. Not aggressive, where it's like, yo, if you don't do that, like nothing like that. But again, assertively, where you're standing in your truth, or you're standing on the fact that these are my boundaries and I'm not going to bend, and you have to respect them. So again, being able to communicate them in a way that folks will be more receptive to receiving and respecting. Also, another tip is learning how to say no without the guilt. And I've heard oftentimes no in and of itself is a complete sentence, and it is okay to say no. And again, to reinforce your priorities and to support your boundaries. Beyond engaging, let's say, with other individuals, kind of more, either in person or face to face or folks in our lives, even looking at how we are able to implement boundaries when it comes to our tech use, right? And this could be, for example, like let's say you're working or you're studying, maybe just putting on the do not disturb mode, maybe on your phone, or, in terms of like turning off notifications if you use Teams or other digital, devices. But that's another way that you can kind of more like implement those boundaries as well, so that others know that, hey, this may not be the best time to reach out or to set up a meeting. So, again, using our technology to also reinforce our boundaries. And when we do so, I think folks really are more likely to respect them. Again, this is not categorically always the case, but when we're more consistent in enforcing our boundaries and we have to remind people or consistently put on that do not disturb at certain times, that's also going to be helpful in reinforcing and really saying that message that I'm taking my boundaries seriously and I'm being consistent in that messaging. And whether you choose to respect them or not, I'm consistent and this is where I'm going to do my best, if anything, to enforce what that looks like. And going from there, again, you might get pushback, especially if you're somebody who might have, been more likely to bend or to have like more fuzzier boundaries, and other people who may know that for, I'm not saying anything about their intentionality behind that, but you might have some pushback. Okay, but I will assure you that the more you practice these boundaries, again, you don't have to be aggressive, but again, reinforcing it, maybe reminding other folks, putting it into practice first within ourselves, that other folks with time will probably be able to more so recognize and respect it in the long term. Not guaranteed, but actually, again, it's more likely. All right, so now we're going to take a look at some self-care strategies and how this can help you as well in finding balance in your role and your experience as a graduate student. And so how I will present on this is really looking at creating this proverbial toolkit where we're going to talk a little bit more about like what does finding your flow look like and the role of mindfulness in terms of cultivating that toolkit as well as practicing gratitude. And so finding your flow. So you're like, okay, Adrian, I've heard this term here and there, or I have no clue what you're talking about. So what does finding your flow look like? And there is actually somebody, this is a Hungarian psychologist, and I, to this day, have trouble actually pronouncing the last name, but nonetheless, they came up with this theory around flow. And one way it's described here is, being completely involved in an activity for its own sake, where you feel like time is flying and every action and movement just flows inevitably. Like basically, you are in your zone. You're being productive, you're creative, whatever that looks like. All right, so with that being said, so okay, that might sound still a little bit elusive. So give me some characteristics more specifically, Adrian. What does that look like? This is when we're able to have higher levels of concentration. Again, remember I was saying how time just kind of flows. You don't know where you get lost in time. Your flow, a feature of that is you're able to have higher levels of concentration. You don't feel too rigorously challenged, but also there's a balance between your current skill set and it's like you're challenged enough to stay engaged. Things are flowing a little bit more effortlessly, and also you're enjoying that experience at the same time. Is our, again, some characteristics of what it looks like to be in flow. And so you might be like, okay, that sounds nice. So how can I kind of like get myself positioned so I can be in more flow? All right. Whether it's around studying or other creative or other areas of my life. Well, you might want to start by actually creating like a focus ritual. And I say that in the most agnostic of ways when I'm talking about rituality. So again, this might like how am I creating routines that help kind of like buffer, get me like primed to know that it's time to focus. Maybe you get yourself situated in a particular place, or you get your snacks, or you do whatever it is to get yourself primed so you can get yourself more aligned to be in flow. Okay. It also could look at choosing the right activity. Now, again, this is like choosing tasks that are challenging and doable to keep you motivated. This may or may not be the case when it comes to schoolwork, but again, if there are other activities or things you want to engage in, being kind of like conscientious on like the level of challenge and is this something that's like feasible for me to do? Again, it can be also, taking into consideration like what it is that I want to achieve, like what's my clear goal. And this can help you as well once you have an idea of what it is that you want to accomplish, even if it's getting in the flow for the sake of flow. That's a clear goal in and of itself. And again, when you're doing this, doing our best to minimize distractions because, again, we want to be in that place where we have high concentration. So that may be turning off notifications, maybe getting yourself in a space where it's quieter, there's less distractions, or even if it's just in your workspace, in your office, or, where you have your space where you do your research, decluttering it so you can have minimal distractions. And again, it looks like also being intentional around making time for deep work. So, this is a time when I am focusing on this particular task and I'm going to do my best to eliminate distractions so I can be more in a state of flow. I'm challenged, but at the same time, I've set myself up so I can have some enjoyment, creative juices. The thinking is going to be a lot more productive, if that makes sense. All right, so we talked about the one aspect of the toolkit around flow, and now I want to talk a little bit more about self-care, particularly through the approach of mindfulness. And so when I use the term mindfulness, I'm really talking about, or I should say, utilizing the definition provided by John Kabat-Zinn, where he defined it as the practice of being able to really pay attention on purpose in the present moment. So you're so in the present. And also, it's kind of like you relinquish the valence of judgment or this is good or this is bad. You're just present, okay, without judgment. This looks like being kind of aware of our thoughts and feelings, maybe our bodily sensations. We're conscious of what we're feeling, right? And our surroundings. And again, there's a lot of research also to show that when we are engaging in mindfulness practices, it can really help us with reducing our stress levels. It can help us to be more focused on task and also help foster the sense of emotional resilience. And so I just have a couple of things that you can easily do a Google search or look up online. I believe this is something I took from Canva, but even just taking a moment and doing some breathing exercises. This, visual here is just kind of guiding a person and how we can breathe. When the circle contracts, that's when we exhale. And when, it expands, that's when you can do inhalations. This is something you don't have to be, isolated from others. You can be at your workspace and get grounded and doing some breathing exercises. Another tool, for example, is a grounding technique that's called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. And this is an opportunity. Again, you can be in public, you can be in private, you can be in your bed before you go to sleep or when you wake up. It's something that helps you again to get mindful and present. By first and foremost, let's say identifying 5 things that you can see in the moment. Once you've done that, what are 4 things tapping into our tactile abilities? What can I touch? Clothing. And then from there, what are 3 things that I currently hear at the moment? Okay. And if you can't necessarily know, well, then, oh, I just hear this. Well, maybe there are other things. So again, we're getting ourselves as closely present to where we are, like in that present state. Next, you're invited to identify 2 things you can smell, and then, if anything, 1 thing you can taste. We're engaging all of the various senses that we have, and in doing so, we're so fully embodied in the present moment that really can help us, like, instead of our minds kind of like going off and getting swirly whirly and all the stressors, but help us to get present, even if it's just for a few minutes. All right, lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about this very powerful tool, approach, whatever adjective you want to use, but is of gratitude. And so, again, I think it's important in terms of language, what do I mean by, gratitude. And so, um, gratitude can be, conceived as, a mental tool that we can use to remind ourselves of just the great things that we actually have in our lives. Okay. It's really a lens to help us see things that oftentimes don't make it onto our list of, problems to be solved, sometimes things that we take for granted. But it helps to shine a spotlight on the good things in our lives. Okay. And so, again, there's plenty of research to show many of the positive benefits associated with gratitude on our health and our well being and on relationships. But I have a few things listed here on this slide. Again, it's helpful in reducing stress. It can enhance emotional resilience. So, that ability to kind of like not get too overwhelmed or out of alignment with how we want to show up when we are faced with certain things that can make us more emotionally kind of like reactive. Maybe we're more responsive instead. Gratitude can help with improving our relationships. And I won't read through all these things, but I'll share a little personal anecdote. I know for myself, especially when times were a little bit challenging, one small practice I did, all right, invited myself to do was at the start of each day. One of the first things when I opened my eyes, I start off with 5 things. What are 5 things I'm grateful for? And I tell you, it has such a compounding impact. The more you do it, it's almost like the more things I'm able to say, or see that I'm actually grateful for. Whether it's I'm so grateful I can actually open my eyes, my senses work, I have a roof over my head, I have food, my family. And the more I did it, it was just like my eyes were illuminated to so many other things I was grateful for. And so when I started to focus on all the things that, whether because of my doing or just because I'm just very fortunate for, things even beyond my control, it really helped me, especially when it came from instead of focusing on all the things or the lack or deficit or things that are causing me stress, kind of shifted my lens to say, hey, there are some assets, there's some great things that are happening, and that lens really helped me in terms of how I approached either, opportunities, situations, or even just, for a lack of better words, just how I show up in places and spaces. and how that impacted relationships and opened potentially some doors and maybe made more bridges in other areas where maybe those relationships weren't there before. We also know, for example, gratitude is also connected with improvements in sleep, interestingly enough, and really helps with, increasing happiness and optimism. So again, I invite you, you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out the reference here, and I'm sure there's other places you can, look into it to find just more about the benefits to our health and well-being with practicing gratitude. All right, folks. So, in the last few minutes, I just want to take a moment just to kind of spotlight some of the health and wellness resources that you all as students have access to here through the Ohio State University. So, starting off first with the Student Wellness Center. And so, we operate on different places here at our central campus here in Columbus. Our main suite is located in the RPAC, or the Recreation Physical Activities Building, in room B130. That's where many of our coaching staff, um, I should say, our wellness coordinators and our director, we have our offices and we have some of our coaching services take place there. I have an asterisk here when it comes to wellness coaching and the location. Um, for a while, we've been operating out of the Physical Activity and Educational Services Building, or PAYS. However, as of autumn of 2025, we are doing some relocating of our wellness coaching services, and we're currently in the RPACT, but more to come in terms of where we're going to kind of more long term, where we're going to reside. So, more to come with that. We have our collegiate recovery community, which is located in 95 Baker Hall, housed within the area where we have our disability student services. And then our newest addition to our Student Wellness Center offerings is something called the Monda Student Resource Center. And they're located in the Youngkin Success Center off Neal Avenue. For folks here on Central Campus, it is across the street from the dental school and kind of more adjacent to the optometry school. All right, so going back again to some of our programs and services through the Student Wellness Center, we're oftentimes known, as we like to say, our big three, which are our coaching services. That includes nutrition, financial, and wellness coaching. And before I actually proceed on with kind of like highlighting some of the features of these programs and services, I think it's important to also state that everything that we offer is at no additional cost, but with the exception of our Condom Club. And so again, the cost comes from your fees as students. So you don't have to pay anything additionally for any of our coaching services or for anything else that's listed, with the exception of our Condom Club. Our Condom Club is not like a traditional club where you have a president, secretary, and things of that nature, but more or less we offer contraceptives to our students any of the days that we're open, basically Monday through Friday in our location in the RPAC. Students are able to come by and they can purchase up to 25 barrier methods, and they also get lubricant for $5. And so that's the one service that there is a payment associated with it. Again, our services also are something private, in kind of contrast to some of our service providers on campus that are confidential. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. And with that, I do want to take a moment to, actually, before I do that, highlight one other service before I talk a little bit more about the Monda Student Resource Center. And that's our collegiate recovery community. Now, we are fortunate to be one of, I want to say either it's between 152 or at this year up to maybe 156 collegiate recovery communities throughout the United States. And the collegiate recovery community is truly a beautiful, intentional community for students who are either in active recovery or considering taking steps towards substance misuse recovery. Again, they're located in Baker Hall, and we have students from undergraduate, graduate, professional, even postgrads who are engaged in this community where they have a regular cadence of support groups. They do a variety of events together, including goat yoga. They've done escape rooms. They have graduation ceremonies. They do tailgating. Again, this is a supportive space and place that's intentionally for students who are in recovery and to help you during your journey as a student. We also have folks on our outreach and engagement team, like myself, who do work around alcohol and other drug prevention, relationship and education violence prevention, and other more general health behavior and health education outreach. And so if folks are like, question mark, what is this Modest Student Resource Center? It is a new resource that opened up in April of 2025 that ultimately serves as a one-stop shop to support students' basic needs. Okay, and so we have something called the Buckeye Food Alliance Food Pantry, which I'm going to pan to the next slide. Here's an image here, which is located in the Youngkin Success Center. All students, there are no limitations in terms of a minimum or maximum when it comes to income. All students can access this resource. They can go to our Student Wellness Center website or the website as you see here and put in a semi-anonymous order for any number of produce, personal care items, meat, carbohydrate or dairy, any type of food items. Put it in, and within a certain number of hours, you're able to go and you're able to pick up that order. Again, it's at no cost, and all students are able to access this resource. I just invite you maybe to check out the QR code here or to go to the Student Wellness website to find out more in terms of hours of operation, which can vary depending on schedules. But generally, the most latest information can be found on our website. Just going to pan back here. In addition to support with the Buckeye Food Alliance, we now offer something called the Reed Family Career Closet, where students are able, again at no cost, to access new or gently used professional or business attire, which can be great when you're going on an interview for a job or an internship. We have these free of charge for students. We also recently hired a full-time, and I will finish up because I see the time is going on. But we have a full-time a case manager who has now joined our team this fall, and they're in place really to help support students when it comes to getting access to things such as emergency financial support, whether they are supports here on campus or outside of campus. We have somebody who is a point person to help you in that event. They're also available to help you support, getting ideas or resources around housing assistance and can even help you with getting safety devices. And so, again, I encourage you all to check out the Modest Student Resource Center, maybe stop by or at least go to the website. And again, I'm happy to also send these slides over so that you can, access them on your free time or you can watch this video. We have a number of great on-demand resources where you can find out more information about our services. And I'm going to just leave this here and you can definitely check those out with the QR code. And I'll leave you with a couple of final thoughts. I want to be the first to validate and recognize that the stress of being a graduate student is real. It's not the same as being a student in high school or undergrad. It comes with its own complications. And so I want to also normalize the fact that it can be a very stressful experience. And also to kind of remind us to like recognize some of the ways that stress shows up in our lives. Are we noticing in ways that, maybe it's showing up with not only with school, but sometimes stressors in our relationships? Am I responding or reacting in particular ways? And kind of just being more aware of what that looks like. And with that, what are some coping strategies? If we're not conscious of what they are, maybe, are there any adaptive things that we can do? Or maybe shifting from some things that might be maladaptive to making them less maladaptive, by maybe not using them as the priority or the first go-to to cope with stress, but maybe looking at opportunities to incorporate more adaptive strategies. I'm also here to remind you that time management, as well as ways of promoting maybe enforcement of healthy boundaries, can help with stress mitigation, and also just inviting you all to take some time if you're not already doing so, but thinking about ways you can prioritize your well-being, by integrating maybe the strategies I discussed with finding flow, mindfulness and gratitude, or other things that you can integrate into your daily routines to help you in enforcing your well-being, and can be self-care strategies. And again, tapping into the campus health and wellness resources that are available to you all. I will go ahead and pan to our very last slide and just want to share my gratitude and appreciation for your time and energy for this past just about an hour of me sharing a lot of information. The conversation does not have to end here. Feel free to reach out to the Student Wellness Center. Here, the information is listed. We also have an Instagram page where you can find out, like, kind of see some of the clips of the various activities and events that we're promoting. And if you want, you can reach out to me directly at wilson.2313. With that, again, thank you. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to doing whatever I can to partner with your department and your school in supporting your well-being. Thank you very much.